We've seen lots of trains, not the ones that would have been affected, but it's good to start with some encouraging news on this Thursday. A tentative deal reached overnight. Around 2 a.m. this morning, the two parties came together and said they got a deal. By 5 a.m., President Biden was announcing this in a written statement. We should point out the reason we're at this train station in Alexandria, Virginia, outside Washington, is because it, like many others now, is expected to see train travel continue as expected, as normally scheduled, with the exception of a handful of Amtrak trains today. Amtrak saying that they are working to quickly restore canceled trains. They had canceled a bunch of long-haul routes, mostly across the Midwest, the Northern Plains, and the South, that run from like New Orleans all the way to the West Coast or Chicago to Seattle, because they couldn't assure, as those trains continued into tonight, that there would be engineers on the tracks making sure they were safe enough. So passenger rail is being restored. As for this deal that's been reached, it was reached after about 20 hours of consecutive face-to-face talks that were held at the Labor Department in Washington. President Biden announcing it in a statement saying, in part, these rail workers will get better pay, improved working conditions, and peace of mind around their health care costs, all hard-earned. A handful of the dozen railroad unions had been holding out for a better agreement on sick leave. They had until tonight at midnight to reach a deal or cause a nationwide strike that would have affected almost 7,000 trains across the country, across about 140,000 miles of track in the 49 states on this continent. We should point out that this is a tentative agreement giving the union several weeks to make sure the deal is ratified and avoid a national shutdown. And it also averts a real supply chain crisis, guys. Remember, we've been talking for the last 2 years about the problems for the trucking industry, for the shipping industry regarding supply chain issues. This would have caused an even bigger one because there weren't enough trucks to move what would have moved across the rails: groceries, crops that were being sent across the country and overseas, fuel. Things like that would have been held up. That's why there was this big push to get this done. And people should know, Amtrak, the unions associated with Amtrak were not involved in this. But the thing with Amtrak is they don't really own most of the rail lines. Yeah, so they were dependent on these other unions and these other companies to make sure that the rails are safe. So then, what happens next now? I mean, I think it was a total of 12 unions that had to hammer things out. There's only a handful of them that still didn't have that deal. Where do we go from here? They're going to have to ratify this agreement in the next few weeks, make sure they're on board with it, and then allow things to continue as normal. But there was a cooling off period negotiated into this deal that gives them some wiggle room here over the next 2 weeks or so to make sure that the agreement's been ratified by members. They got a lot out of this deal. One of our colleagues spoke with a union official a little while ago, calling this a, quote, real win, because they were able to get what they call improvement toward life benefits. Agreements were made on time off without penalties, paid personal leave. This is the first time the railroad companies were forced to negotiate or bargain over attendance policies. The issue that many of these railroad workers had is they don't necessarily get paid leave or time off the way you and I do. Like if we get sick and we got to call out for work, we're fortunate enough to work for a place that allows us to do that. If you get sick or you get the call that somebody in your family's died and you're out on the rails, there's no way for you to pull over the train, get off, and go home. And so they were trying to figure out a way to address the lack of paid leave time. They have sorted that out. They're going to see some big pay increases for most of these workers as well, and some lump sum payments. This comes, it should be noted, with the help of a labor-friendly administration. The Biden administration was involved in all this because, of course, the rails are a big part of the economic and to some extent national security pipeline in that they move so many goods and dangerous goods across the country. The Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh, oversaw these talks at the Labor Department over the last day or so. He's a former labor organizer. This is a president who, of course, has spent his entire political career enjoying the political support of labor unions. So a big win for them at a time when there are so many concerns about strikes and workers' issues across the country, but also, of course, those concerns about how a supply chain hiccup could disrupt the economy.
So, Ed, let me ask you to sort of recap for our audience how the Biden administration got involved in the negotiations, and ultimately, what kind of weight did they carry? I'm assuming some.
Big amount, because, again, the federal government can step in on railroad worker issues and operation of the rails by federal law. If, for example, a deal was not going to be reached tonight, there was a chance that the House and Senate could have passed a piece of legislation that would have essentially stopped railroad workers from striking. It would have blocked that. They did it twice in the 1980s. It had been done in the past before. And again, it's sort of for continuity of society because of who and what moves on the rails across the country that that Congress could step in that way. That's why the Labor Department was involved in this. They are anyway, and they had been for the last several months. Talks had formally begun in the spring. Most of the unions had signed off. There were 2 or 3 that had held out for this big deal, and that is why you saw in the last few days presidential involvement. We were told, for example, last night the president phoned into the talks over at the labor union or at the Labor Department at about 9 p.m., telling them to keep going, and they cut a deal around 2 a.m. this morning, announcing it around 5 a.m. Eastern.
I think it's so remarkable that like a technology that this country, started having in the 1800s is still like the backbone of the economy.
And we are lagging far behind some of our allies and other countries, partner countries that have incredible railway systems. I mean, when I lived in France, I only traveled by rail across the country.
Yeah.
It's much more difficult to get that done here. Ed O'Keefe, always great to have you, my friend. Thank you, sir.
Take care.